The Divine Sage by J.P. Cunningham. Narrated by David Sweeney-Bear. It matters not how strait the gate, how charged with punishments the scroll. I am the master of my fate. I am the captain of my soul. Invictus by W. E. Henley, 1875. The Letter, 25th September 1844, Royal Naval Hospital at Haslar, Plymouth. Dear Mr. Burney, as you may be aware from recent reports in the newspapers, Captain Basil Hall passed away on the 15th of this month, having suffered for nearly 2 years from a degenerative disease of the mind characterized by violent fits and progressive dementia. Basil and I had been close friends for many years before his incarceration at Haslar, and I can assure you that during his time with us he was afforded the best treatments we have available and resided in a private room with a view of the hospital garden. It might also give you comfort to know that he never once was taken downstairs to the lower corridors of the asylum, where the less fortunate patients must live out their days in such torment. I have enclosed with this letter a notebook belonging to Basil, the contents of which were written in the last few weeks of his life, at a time when the fits he was experiencing were daily occurrences, and his body and mind were steadily weakening from these cruel and relentless blows. As you will soon discover, the narrative within bears no small resemblance to Basil's book, published to considerable acclaim some years ago, extracts from a journal written on the coasts of Chile, Peru, and Mexico, inasmuch as the dates and stopping points along the way appear to be, for the most part, the same. But for the rest, I cannot say, except that, having read the notebook from start to finish, I am concerned for the captain's reputation, and for the well-being of his surviving family, should this material fall into the wrong hands. Although it is my personal belief that the notebook might better be destroyed, Basil's last wish was that I give it to you. On the evening he passed away, I entered his room to find him standing by the window, with his fingers pressed against the pane, his face lit by the light of the setting sun. It is a moment I shall never forget as long as I live. He turned to me, and I saw in his eyes the old friend I have loved and admired for many years. "I am returned, John," he said. "I have passed through the invisible, and now I am returned." It was then that he insisted I find you, Mr. Burney, wherever you were in the world, and then, just like that, the light in his eyes went out, and he fell into the grip of a severe fit. It was one from which he did not return. Under normal circumstances, the transfer of material belonging to a patient at Haslar would be strictly prohibited, but in this instance I find myself able to do so, as this can be considered a matter of medical interest passing from the hands of one physician to another. As such, if you choose to read the enclosed notebook, I trust that you will do so as a physician who has sworn an oath to never divulge secrets of a patient's life that ought not to be spoken. For my own part, I have no intention to discuss the contents of the notebook further, either with my colleagues or with Basil's surviving family, nor will I speak of its existence beyond this letter. The Divine Sage belongs to you now, Mr. Burney. Respectfully, Dr. John Richardson, F.R.C.S., Head Physician. Part 1. Charles. Chapter 1. HMS Conway, Cape Horn, 26 November 1820. In all my days, I have never seen anything quite so beautiful as the aurora australis, which I had good fortune to witness on the night we navigated Cape Horn. The mysterious celestial light appeared shortly after nightfall, first as a shimmering arc of green fire over the southern horizon, then growing by degrees until its luminous tendrils stretched high into the starlit heavens, wavering and dancing above the Conway's creaking masts and flapping sails. Our passage up until that point had been one of little excitement. Rounding the Cape is widely regarded as the foremost test of seamanship, and I had spent the weeks before our departure from England poring over maps and seeking advice on how best to survive the unpredictable tides and strong winds that dominate these latitudes. But upon entering the chilly waters of the southern Atlantic, we experienced only clear skies and favourable breezes. Indeed, when earlier that same evening we finally spotted the jagged coastline of the Tierra del Fuego on the western horizon, I could not help but feel a little disappointed. There it was, the infamous promontory that has gained such celebrity in nautical history, silhouetted against the dying rays of the sun. Yet, as ship's captain, what had I done besides pace back and forth on the icy deck, puffing on my pipe and listening to the wind whistling through the ropes? At any rate, the aurora was to change all that. It was every bit as breathtaking and otherworldly as the salty accounts one hears from old mariners in the taverns of Plymouth docks. Down on the main deck the men stood in an eerie silence, open-mouthed, with clouds of breath collecting over their heads. Some of the more nimble sailors had climbed high into the rigging, as if drawn up in a rapture towards the bewitching luminosity that snaked between the constellations, shining with such brilliance that the Conway's sails were dyed a ghostly green. Alone, on the quarterdeck with the collars of my coat pulled in tight about my neck, I took in the heavenly show. I found myself in a deep contemplation as to what forces lay behind its manifestation, the vagaries of weather and accumulations of atmospheric particles that must coincide to bring such a magnificent display into existence. What purpose did the aurora serve in the grander scheme of things? Did it exist solely to strike awe into the hearts of lonely sailors? To remind us that the majesty of the universe will forever outdo the majesty of men, its secrets remaining forever beyond our grasp? I was snapped out of my train of thought by the appearance of a swinging lantern, which wove its way across the main deck. A shadowy figure climbed the ladderway and walked towards me, his shoulders hunched against the cold. It was George Burney, the Conway's surgeon. "Have you ever seen the like?" I said, still gazing up at the shimmering light. Burney gave the aurora only a momentary glance. "I'm afraid I have some troubling news, Captain. We have lost Mr. Gillies." John Gillies was our only paying passenger and suffered from incipient consumption, a chronic form of the disease that did not kill its victims outright, but left them lingering in ill health for many years. 8 weeks previously, I had watched 2 of my midshipmen escort Gillies onto the Conway at Plymouth docks. His sallow complexion, bent posture, and unsteady gait made him look twice his 28 years. If the truth be known, I did not expect the man to survive a fortnight, let alone the 3-month voyage to the coasts of the New World. I placed a consoling hand on the doctor's shoulder. "We shall have a burial at first light, and I will write a letter to his next of kin." Burney raised the lantern, the flickering flame reflecting in his spectacles. "Mr. Gillies is not dead, sir. He appears to have vanished." "What? I cannot find him anywhere, sir." "I thought you said the man was confined to his cot." "He was," the doctor insisted. "This afternoon, when I paid him a visit, he could barely lift a glass of water to his lips." "Men do not simply vanish," I told him. "Mr. Gillies must have awoken in a delirium and stumbled out of his cabin. Is he being administered laudanum?" Burney shook his head. "He refuses to take anything but those herbal concoctions of his. I have searched every cabin, cupboard, and storeroom, all the way down to the hold." I gazed into the darkness beyond the railings. The constellation of the Southern Cross, that much-loved celestial anchor for mariners, was rising above the horizon. Taking out my tinderbox, I relit my pipe while I considered the situation. Well, then, the only explanation remaining is that the poor fellow has found his way up here and fallen overboard. The doctor rubbed his forehead with his gloved hand. I don't believe John was capable of— Then what are you suggesting? I said, grabbing hold of one of the cat lines to steady myself as the Conway leapt over a succession of waves. A sprinkling of snowflakes fell from the rigging above. That our Mr. Gillies has been spirited away? No, sir, of course not. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Lieutenant Woollerton on the quarterdeck. Woollerton was the lowest in rank of the Conway's 3 lieutenants, despite being the oldest, a situation that he had not ceased complaining about since our departure from England. The lieutenant's dour and cynical disposition was evident at his interview, throughout which I listened to a diatribe of criticism against his previous commander, and summarily pegged the gloomy Yorkshireman sitting across my desk as the kind who was quick to find fault in others, whilst being quite oblivious to his own shortcomings. But alas, it transpired that I had little choice in selecting him for the voyage. Having served for more than 2 decades as midshipman without receiving a promotion, the Admiralty had already decided that Woollerton should be given a chance to prove himself. "Still no sight nor sound of Mr. Gillies?" the lieutenant asked, dragging his vowels as Yorkshire folk tend to do. "Mind you, I always knew he were trouble. One of them clever types who thinks himself above the rest of us. And taking a voyage halfway round the world in such a state of poor health makes you wonder." My fingers tensed irritably around the stem of my pipe as I sought to relight it. From what I gather, Mr. Gillies was braving this passage to benefit from the mild climate Chile has to offer. Aye, well, there were always something queer about that man if you ask me, the lieutenant went on, taking little heed of what I said. I heard he were dismissed from another ship owing to a matter of misconduct involving a young officer. The lad died of a fever, so they say, but there were rumours he were poisoned by one of Mr. Gillies' medications. That is absolute rubbish, Bernie interjected sharply. Mr. Gillies retired from the Navy owing to his declining health, and for that reason alone. He threw me an exasperated glance before turning back to Woollerton. And, for your information, the young officer was dying of yellow fever. I can assure you Mr. Gillies would have done all he could to save his life. Aye, and you doctors stick together. Woollerton tapped his nose conspiratorially. That hypocritic oath you swear by. Bernie rolled his eyes. Hippocratic oath, and it has nothing to do with doctors sticking together. The lieutenant shrugged dismissively. At any rate, I were going to say that we found him. He pointed across the deck towards the bow. Mind you, I think he might be frozen stiff. Why didn't you say something before? Bernie snapped. I were getting to it, Woollerton replied, clearly enjoying his petty triumph over the doctor. Mr. Legg is seeing to him. Sounds to me as if this might have been his fault, but I shall leave it to him to explain. The doctor and I hurried across the deck and climbed the stairway to the bow, finding Lieutenant Legg crouching beside a pile of frozen ropes under the foremast. I am dreadfully sorry, sir, he gabbled, and then stood up and saluted, all pale-faced and ruddy-cheeked in the lamplight. This is all my fault. I was called to Mr. Gillies' cabin earlier. He said it was the doctor's orders that he should get some air. Bernie held his lantern aloft, revealing a pair of skinny legs sticking out from a bundle of snow-covered blankets. I said no such thing. When was this? Shortly after sunset, sir. Did he say which doctor gave these orders? I asked, clambering over the bowlines to take a closer look at the body swaddled in blankets. Legg looked confused. No, sir. Mr. Gillies is a former surgeon for His Majesty's Royal Navy, I explained. He may have been referring to himself. It was Gillies, all right, frost clinging to his mutton-chop whiskers and eyebrows, his spectacles sitting crookedly across his nose. He looked dead enough to me, sunken-cheeked and blue-lipped as he was. Reaching down, I placed the back of my hand on his cheek. It was cold, but the skin was still soft. He might yet be alive. Clutching his jaw, I moved his head about. "Bernie, come take a look." The doctor stepped between the ropes. Pressing his fingers against the man's neck, he felt for a pulse. "We must get him below deck." As we positioned ourselves to lift Gillies, there was movement beneath his eyelids, as if his eyeballs were rolling about. All at once he awoke and glanced around wildly before looking me straight in the eye. "I saw you," he gasped, his voice strained and hoarse. "Down there, in the darkness. It was you." "Yes, well, I'm up here too," I said, assuming him to be in a delirium. "You must try and stay with us, Mr. Gillies." I removed his spectacles for safekeeping. "We are going to carry you to my cabin and get you warmed up." His eyes darted towards the sky, widening further still as he took in the aurora, a luminous green ribbon billowing directly over our heads. "The light," he whispered. "He is watching us, Captain." Gillies remained with his eyes locked on the aurora for a few moments more before slipping under. He did not speak again, nor show any signs of returning to consciousness, while we lumbered him across the deck and down the companionway steps to the great cabin. Stretching him out on the seating beneath the long window, I covered him with a thick woolen blanket. "If he pulls through, there must be no more incidents like this," I said, taking 3 glasses from the cabinet and pouring each of us a whiskey. "Aside from all the kerfuffle, I do not want the crew thinking our only passenger has lost his marbles. You know what it's like." I handed the 2 men their drinks. "If they see Gillies staggering around in a delirium, they will start gossiping, and the next thing you know, there will be all manner of stories flying about. Sailors have active imaginations, as you well know." I took another look at Gillies. He was out cold and wore an oddly contented look on his face. I suppose I could hardly blame the fellow for hoodwinking Legg like that in order to catch a glimpse of the aurora, especially given the man could have precious few nights left on this earth to enjoy. Only then did another thought occur to me. "Of course, it might be possible," I began, holding my whiskey up to the light to admire its deep golden sheen, "that Gillies was not expecting to return tonight at all." Bernie frowned at me. "You think he deliberately went up on deck, knowing he would perish out there in the cold?" "He muttered something about seeing the light," I replied with a casual shrug. "Is that not what dying men talk of?" Leaving the 2 men to keep watch over our frozen passenger, I climbed back up the ladderway into the chilly night. I was on deck just in time to see the last traces of the aurora fade away before my eyes. Leaning against the mast, I gazed up at the star-encrusted heavens. Venus was out tonight, and Jupiter too. I mused a little over Gillies's words. "He is watching us, Captain," trying to imagine what the world must look like from up there in the icy firmament. The contours of the many continents, separated by vast stretches of black ocean, and what the Conway must look like, a speck of white, inching its way through the narrow strip between the tail of South America and the polar ice caps of Antarctica. The Divine Sage is available free on this site for a limited period, with new episodes added each week. If you're enjoying the story and don't want to wait, check out thedivinesage.net for details of where to purchase the full audiobook.